Hi everyone. I will do the updated slides as a YouTube video again, and this means we will have a look into critical whiteness studies together. Yeah, basically as it was in the tutorial, we will not do the check-in because that is a tutorial related thing. We will, however, look into race, racism, and ethnicity a little bit, and then go over to critical whiteness studies, which is this week's lecture's content. I also have some application tasks, even though I think I will not discuss them in great detail, but rather have some thoughts which might also be thought-provoking for you, and you can just try to think about them yourself. We skip that. And this is the revision. Last week we had the topic of race and ethnicity, and I found a very fitting quote by John Storey, who writes, "Whether it is made to signify or not, physical difference between human beings exists." That acknowledges that, yes, humans do look different, and not everybody is the same in the physical sense. He further continues, "But how they are made to signify is always a result of politics and power rather than a question of biology." This term of signification, or also linked to signifying practice in Stuart Hall's sense, relates to this idea of making meaning in the world, distributing meaning, and attaching meaning to the existent things in the world. So basically what he says here is, as soon as we start making sense of those physical differences between human beings, that is a result of politics and power. The question of who makes those differences and who has the power to basically also then use them for or against other people, to whom is it an advantage or to whom not. And this then is not related to biology anymore. So as soon as we start categorizing, we have power and politics and culture in the whole equation. Um, and this also goes for, or mostly in this case, because it's about physical difference between human beings in the sense of race. I mean, there are also other physical differences which are concerned with abilities, and this would then be disability studies. Here we are with race and ethnicity, so we're looking at race. Which is basically the idea that humans look different because of biological causes, and then furthermore that these differences connect to not only physical appearance, but social and mental features, capacities, and abilities of people. So basically that you can classify people according to different races, which are genetically determined, and then say that a certain race is more primitive or more civilized and more prone to be so than the other. This process of differentiating and then also making categories and describing these differences is called racialization. This term will turn up in the session of today quite a lot. And then we have racism. Racism as the ideology of one race being superior to the other, and then used as legitimation of domination, exploitation, and mistreatment of others. Sounds complicated. Let's think about the example from last week, colonialism, when basically this idea of racism and one race, in this case, basically, of course, sadly enough, the white race as superior over everyone else is seen as the dominant ideology. And then white people as colonizers going over the world and going somewhere where there are non-white people, then using this ideology in order to legitimize their idea of we are superior, you are not superior because you have a different skin color, you have different abilities and different capacities, you are not as civilized as we are, you are primitive, and therefore we can dominate, exploit, and mistreat you. That is basically what is behind this. And then another important concept with regard to this discussion is then ethnicity, which is, and that's similar to race, also a way of explaining distinctions between human beings. But this time it's not based upon biology, based upon culture. So it depends on where do you come from, not only nation or country-wise, but also in the sense of which social groups, which environments did you grow up with, what's the language, what are values, what are norms, what are beliefs you follow. So basically everything that shapes your sense of being, your way of life, is then seen as creating those differences between people. And in this discussion, we are mostly looking at so-called ethnical or racial minorities. And that is basically what critical whiteness theory is also concerned about and tries to challenge in a way. With the research focus on ethnic minorities and their disadvantages when it comes to race, one could, however, also ask, okay, but what about the majority? And this basically looks into, okay, if some people are seen as people of color with certain disadvantages, is it not actually the case that the people who are not seen as people of color also have a certain skin color, in this case white, and that maybe there is structural inequality which can be described in terms of racialized identities, not only taking into account like people of color, so people who are not white, but taking into account also the idea of whiteness as white skin color, white racialized identity, and how this also fuels unequal power structures. And one disclaimer about this question of majority, because actually, yes, there are nations where white people are the predominant people, where we have a majority of whiteness, so to say, and this is especially the case in Europe, for example. Thinking about the UK, we have approximately 75% of the people as what we can call British white. Um, and also about other nations of Europe, there you have the people who are predominantly white. But if you think about the bigger picture and also take into consideration Asia, Africa, Australia, and the American context, then it might come to mind that actually not the majority of people are white, but the majority of people are of a different skin color and ethnicity. And so you can say that whiteness is actually not the majority, but, and this is why this perspective is a little bit different than race theory, and also very interesting and compelling perspective, because white people still hold the majority of power in the world. And this has to do with the history. History of race and racism can also be seen as a history of cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism, key term. Cultural imperialism means that a certain culture is impositioned as universally valued and valuable, and then people just install these cultural values and systems somewhere else in another context and basically override the existing culture. An example for this is easy colonialism. People from, in this case, Eurocentric or European background um, had the ideology that they were the superior and they also could, because they were superior, dominate and basically exploit and take over the world and have their empire. The British Empire is something which is well known because the British were, sadly enough, very good at colonializing the world. So basically what happened was not only that they exploited resources in the world and just went there and said, no, this is ours, but also that they really installed their cultural systems, their values, their beliefs. So basically, the perspectives of this minority all over the world. One example can also be the English language. So English is seen as a world language, as a lingua franca, but actually that's quite a lot related to colonialism and the spread of this language as one part of a cultural system that was just distributed over the whole world as cultural imperialism. And what we now have is more or less a hegemony of perspectives of this white minority, and this still holds quite a lot of power in the world. And this is what we can see as very critical by critical whiteness studies. And critical whiteness studies views whiteness as more or less three things: a racialized identity, an analytical tool, and the invisible norm in society. What does this mean? Let's have a look. Sorry for those weird clicking noises. I actually just had some difficulties of switching the slides, but here we are. Racialized identity. So let's think about race and the idea of differentiating human beings according to biology, according to skin color. And that's what is done here as well. But of course, that is a huge homogenization. Because, of course, if you describe people as white and only go after skin color, then you do away with all the diversity and also the so-called intersectionality of how do gender and social class also influence where people are positioned in society. But as an analytical perspective, that actually does make sense because then you can look into structures in society which are predominantly related to race and not just complicate this picture with everything else. But one should always keep in mind that this is just a theoretical perspective and not like a real complete identity, which can be essentialized. So we can homogenize it and say this is one factor that contributes, but it is never the complete picture. But one perspective one can use for analysis. And racialized identity also implies that whiteness as a racialized identity only exists in relation to the other racialized categories. Other racialized categories would be what we call people of color, Black identity, also Asian identity, even though that also coincides with culture because Asia is not really like a skin color you can ascribe to people. But basically, all these other categories um, exist, and therefore whiteness should also be taken into consideration. And if one says, okay, but why do we need whiteness? We don't need the category of whiteness to analyze, then one should also not need all the other categories because they exist in relation to one another. But I think I have talked about analysis quite a lot, and this is why whiteness in critical whiteness studies is also very much an analytic tool. So it is a tool or a lens through which you can look at structures of inequality in society. And you can use whiteness as a model for researching, at one hand, overarching structures in society. So basically, structural racism just from the other perspective and not from how are people with a certain skin color disadvantaged, but how does whiteness influence the whole picture? How does having a white skin color feature in the greater system? But also, as a combination perspective here, how do experiences of individuals relate to whiteness? How can individuals experience this? Because if we're thinking about models and theories and the big picture, so to say, one should always take into consideration that this big picture actually consists of very many small individual perspectives, and they basically make it up. So if you look at structures and individuals at the same time, you can have quite a full picture of the world, but neither one or the other is a complete picture. And then whiteness is said to be the invisible norm in society. Invisible norm because whiteness can be seen as the unmarked identity. A very good example is this idea of people of color. Well, everyone has a skin color, not only people of color. So we could say that whiteness is here just seen as the norm and therefore not seen as a skin color because it is invisible, an invisible identity, and this experience of just not being racialized all the time. Other examples of this as invisible or also very explicit norms um, the first one is an example, the so-called danger of a single story. This is basically taken from a talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She is a Nigerian writer, and she basically gave that talk in 2009 and talks about her reading of literature because when she grew up in the Nigerian context as part of a Black middle class family within a completely and within a surrounding of people of color always. So there were not really white people in there, but she grew up reading the literature which was available in English. And this was literature that featured white protagonists. So all that was represented in literature was white, Western, and not Nigerian and Black. So what happened to her then was when she began writing stories, the first stories she wrote actually only related to white people and Western context. She could not imagine that people of color, people like her, were represented in literary works because predominantly white people were represented. And this actually, so how does this relate to this unmarked identity category? Within a Western society where you feel like, okay, everyone is more or less white and this is what we relate to, you have the representation of this in literature, in film, in media, and you don't even notice that you set this as a norm for basically all the context. But once it comes into different context, it suddenly is seen that actually that is not a very good norm because that is not the complete picture. And then also an example that relates to our check-in questions. Our check-in question was, what skin color does the Christian Holy Family usually have in the Western context? And we all more or less agreed on, well, mostly it is white, or at least lightish skin color, and not something dark, something which would actually fit the background they're from. And yes, I said more or less agreement because, yes, we did remember that there sometimes was someone who was not like white, and sometimes the baby Jesus was not blonde, but usually it was. And so we can also say that a certain background is just done away with in order to assimilate a certain story into the Western background. So you have this norm which is just imposed on everything and all the cultural representations. Let's have a look at one example. The map you can see on the left is actually a pretty weird map because it does show England and Wales. You can't say it's a map of the UK. Northern Ireland and Scotland are missing. You can also not say it's a map of England because Wales is still there. But I think we should focus ourselves on England here because I think in England there it is very prevalent or very obvious that white British population is actually, yes, the majority, but no, by no means everyone who is living there, especially in the big cities. So the big one in the south is, of course, London. And if we go up, we have Birmingham, Coventry, then it's Leicester, and then up there it's Liverpool, Manchester, and Leeds, and then also some other smaller conurbations. But all these urban spheres are very much affected by a environment which is, yes, to a certain extent white British, but also to a very significant extent not white British, but from a different ethnicity, and also having people there who are from a different skin color. And then we have the article which I linked there, and the article basically describes how areas such as school education, higher education, job possibilities, police investigation, housing allocation, so basically whether you get or not get a social home, and also health, at one hand related to the NHS, which is the health system in the UK, and also to questions like who is more likely to become a drug addict. Such areas are subject to differences based upon racialization of non-white individuals. This means, no, it's not actually that your life is easier if you are white, but it's actually not made harder by the fact that you have a certain skin color and therefore are subject to racism, possibly. Um, you can think yourself of certain examples. In the tutorial, we mentioned, for example, with regard to education, that people are perceived as more likely to belong to a certain social class. You have class stereotypes featuring, also language stereotypes can feature and can then disable you from certain perspectives at school. And then concerning job possibilities with regard to names and also with regard to outlooks, people with non-racialized identities are more likely to be invited to a job interview. Police investigation has something called racial profiling. This means that people who are racialized as non-white are more likely to be seen as doing something criminal and are also persecuted and watched more closely than people who are predominantly white. Yeah. So this shows that there is a whole system of, in a way, privilege for people who have white skin color and disadvantage for people who don't have that, and that there's a structure within the society which or disables certain features based on whiteness. One can say that the UK situation resembles the global situation when it comes to white privilege, but with that map and those examples, I think we can have a look at how does whiteness and non-whiteness feature and how are they related to each other. Now you can see that the color of the title changed, and this usually means now it's your turn to speak. Actually, it doesn't because I'm the only one speaking in that presentation because it's a video. Have a look at these questions and think about how you can relate these to the things we just talked about. Try to answer them for yourself. Maybe some important things which I want to take in from the tutorial. About the first one, this idea of systematic supremacy is also related to this dominant term of white supremacy, and we will talk about this not in detail, but a little bit later. And then this idea of absence and invisibility, it relates not to the absence and invisibility of representation for people of color, but about the absence and invisibility of this norm of whiteness. And then, with regard to cultural capital, cultural capital is a concept by Bourdieu, and you might think about that and then remember what it was. And whiteness is basically, when it comes to cultural capital, seen as something which is valued as having more cultural capital, and also because of those educational advantages you have if you have a white skin color and non-disadvantages, so to say. So if you have a white skin color, it's just much more likely that you have a good education or a better education than someone who is not white. And this basically makes whiteness also a certain kind of cultural capital. And concerning the invisible norm, this question is much related to the idea of cultural imperialism, and you can also link it to Marxist ideas of the distribution of resources, also in the capital direction, and then with racist legitimation of inequalities, and this is very much related to ideology. So you can try to also incorporate perspectives which we have discussed during the last weeks. White privilege is another of our key terms. And yeah, let's have a look at this picture first. Maybe some things about representation and how could you describe this picture and make sense out of it. If you have the cultural knowledge, then you will notice it is England, most likely London because of the telephone boxes, and it is most likely in COVID times because people are wearing masks over their faces. But this is not our focus right now. Our focus are the posters. The one in the center reads, "White privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It means that your skin color isn't one of the things making it harder." And that is basically white privilege in a nutshell. It's not about having a super easy, smooth life and everything is just perfectly smoothly running because you're white. It's actually just that you're better off because you're not racialized. Race is not one of the categories which are used to judge you all the time and which can become a disadvantage to you. And the other poster reads, "White silence is violence." And this is related to complicity. The idea that even though one might not be actively involved in the creation of one idea, one can still very well be complicit with that idea by just contributing to the idea by not doing something which is like implicitly related to that. And in this case, if one stays stays silent as a white person, and does not challenge the system which grants white people certain privileges, then this results to violence for people who are not part of this white system, people who are in the out group. So basically, complicity makes things harder for people who are not in the in group of white people. White privilege can be summarized as the absence of race as means of discrimination. Maybe you can also link that to the examples which we had when it came to the UK and white as a category and how predominant white is in the UK, and also where people with a white skin color have certain advantages. Whiteness and white privilege are also related to representation. It's at one hand the right or the privilege to be represented all the time, so also related to having role models in literature, in film, in popular culture basically, but also to be able to represent the category of human, so to say, and that without an identifier of race. The idea with human without an identifier is from a video that I have linked on the last slide as well, where Tom Nicholas explains whiteness and white privilege quite neatly, I think. And yes, he has the idea of race ascribing a certain identity to people, so that basically if you have a certain race, and this basically links to one of the statements in this picture there, if you have a certain racialized identity, for example you are black, then you are related to speaking on behalf of this group of people. You are, when you're speaking up, speaking for black people. But the thing is, if you have white skin color, then this does not only go for you, but You can, when you speak on behalf of the whole world, so to say, because you are seen as speaking on behalf of the whole category of human, but without this identifier of race, because it is the absence of race as means of discrimination. White privilege is also heavily criticized, and this is mostly related to the idea of homogenization. We discussed that in the very beginning. If you use whiteness as a category, you do away with gender and with social class. So you don't consider intersectionality and that people with white skin color are not ultimately privileged, but there are certain things complicating the picture. But this critique might also not take into consideration that if we're discussing class or age or social relations within society, we're usually also not taking everything into account. We're usually analyzing from one certain perspective. And that's why whiteness can definitely be used as an analytic perspective, because if you look from one perspective and don't say that this is the all-determining perspective, then that can definitely be taken into consideration. And then there is a term which is also used very often, which is white supremacy. And this relates to the systematic quality of white privilege, that it is not only related to individuals, as it is also represented in this picture. There are certain individuals making statements about white privilege, which I think are pretty illustrative of the context. You can have a look yourself. But that this is a whole system of discrimination and privilege which is in place and also maintained and also challenged within society. So this systematic quality. Yeah, those are two application questions again. How could the result of the US elections be analyzed using the category of white privilege? And then the idea of criticism and why can or why can't we use whiteness as a theoretical perspective. Garner, which is the author of the text that was the reading for this week, uses 5 pitfalls of using whiteness as a paradigm in order to explain what one should maybe consider when one thinks about whiteness. And I will explain them shortly and hope that you gain an understanding of them. So the first one is whiteness gets reified. Reification might be a term you have no idea about. And don't worry, I really didn't know what it means when I read the text the first time as well. So reification basically relates to turning a concept that is there into an essence or into an object. So basically using the concept onto something specific and then saying that this objectifies and this really embodies this concept. Reification happens quite a lot in the society because concepts are usually applied and then seen as core of something. But especially with whiteness, that is very dangerous because if you reify whiteness, then you describe whiteness as an inherent quality of human beings and whiteness as an identity marker that can really be used and seen as so homogenizing. And that is just not true. So one should think about whiteness as still something theoretical and something that can be used in order to analyze context, but never presents the whole picture. This is also related to the second pitfall of using whiteness as a paradigm, which is seeing whiteness as fluid and contingent all the time. This would then say, okay, it's only a theoretical perspective, therefore it's constructed and it does not really, so also going back to the idea that race as distinguishing humans does not really have an empirical basis, because yes, there are differences, but as soon as you start making sense of those differences and describe them in certain ways, it's culture, it's constructed. And the second pitfall would then really overemphasize this constructedness and say, yes, but there are this and these aspects to consider, and then make it basically not really applicable to everyday life. And would also not consider that there are real life consequences of the term whiteness and the concept of whiteness. The third pitfall would be there's a level playing field. But this is not true because whiteness, yes, at one hand is a racialized identity as all the others, because yes, whiteness exists in relation to other racialized identity. And if we say that there are people of color who are non-white, then one should also consider that people who are white also are people of a certain skin color. But there is still a distinction between whiteness and what we call people of color, because there is this explicit difference of who has the power and which category is more or less seen as unnoticed and not the dominant category of hegemony, world representation, who holds capital in the world. There is a really major difference between whiteness and other racialized identities, and this should not be neglected. The fourth one is basically also about this problematic, recentering whiteness studies. So if we make whiteness studies about differences between white individuals and are trying to figure out, okay, what differences are there between white people from this background and this background, it would be focusing on the white subject instead of using this category as it is intended in relation to the power structures and also the relation to other racialized identities. So this fourth pitfall is closely linked to the aim of whiteness studies, critical whiteness studies, namely addressing the relations which exist between racial identities and also challenging these relations, then looking into power inequality, structural racism, and how it all connects. But it's not about thinking about, okay, what differences are there within this whiteness category? Because for this, we do actually have other terms. We do have gender, we have social class, we have age, for example. We have social categories which we are used in order to look at people from a different perspective. Whiteness as a category was really implemented in order to analyze those racialized structures, and thus it should not be recentered and refocused onto the white subject. And the fifth pitfall is studying whiteness and seeing that as an automatically anti-racist, activity. Because whiteness and as the category and then the acknowledgement of this as important for the own life or important for the life of people, important for analysis, can only be seen as a starting point. So you can analyze the circumstances, you can point out inequality on an analytical level, but this is no action in itself. An action would then be take those findings and go into the world and try to change things. So studying whiteness is not automatically anti-racist. And especially if one then really tries to define structures in society, finds things, but doesn't really do anything about it, then we also go into the direction of this idea of complicity. So if you don't do anything against it, even though you know what should be done, what could be done, isn't one then complicit in maintaining the circumstances which are unequal and really unfair to other people? So this is basically 5 pitfalls one should consider when one uses whiteness, and where one should critically also question one's own perspective of, am I doing that right now? Or am I really applying this perspective with a certain aim that is anti-racist and also in the direction of not neglecting certain disadvantages and certain aspects which are there in the field. Yes, so this is basically the concluding slide. You can have a look and think about, do I know what all these terms mean? If so, perfect. If not, maybe have a listen and also try to find out where you can have other ideas and other sources to that. Have a look at the lecture, have a look at the text and try to figure out what it means until you do know. I know that my explanations are by no means the perfect and definite and for everyone applicable explanations. I'm trying my best, but sometimes it just doesn't fit, and sometimes one doesn't get the content if one person explains it. And then try finding another video, looking at the lecture, at the text, and figure out what is your way of understanding what we discussed today. And this is now our final slide of this week's presentation. It's an analysis task, and yes, if you were in the tutorial, then you know what we talked about, and we discussed this already. If you weren't, then think yourself, think how you can use today's perspectives in order to approach these pictures. Also think about what we discussed last week with regard to how to approach a cultural text. What can you see? How can you link this to theoretical concepts, and what does it mean for these concepts? Yeah, and then we have a look at the sources. Those are basically the sources that I used. You can have a look at the links and also use them as reading recommendations. And I mean, the text by Ghana was already the reading task for this week. And with that, I say goodbye and thank you for listening.